Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain, and this week we get to discuss everyone's favorite season. Continuing on with the theme of dysfunctional teams leads us to one of the most dysfunctional seasons ever, a season filled with good ideas, great ideas, unique ideas, but ideas all bogged down under the weight of poor execution. We've talked a fair bit about how Overdrive couldn't get out of its own way, even on its best day, but during those discussions, we never extensively covered the characters, so now we're going to do just that, and discuss why several of them don't really work. As most of you know, for me, characters make or break a season, and I don't think there's ever been, nor will we ever see, a genuinely good Ranger season that lacks genuinely good characters. With conceptual seasons like Time Force and RPM, the characters being good, great, or perfectly imperfect is almost a natural result of the concepts themselves, on top of the acting and writing. But then you also think about less conceptual seasons like Ninja Storm or Dino Charge. Both are arguably lesser seasons by comparison, but both have multiple good or great characters that made the missteps less egregious. And even the lesser characters in either season aren't awful, they mostly just don't get enough screen time. And if Overdrive could claim this, then it would likely never be seen by some as the worst season ever, even though I think that distinction is a little much. Now, on to the question of the day. Why don't Overdrive's characters work? Not just the Rangers, but the characters in general. Let's discuss by first starting with the man that created Overdrive, Mr. Andrew Hartford. Hartford should have been a very interesting character. The man made a fortune by essentially being the Indiana Jones of the Ranger world, and he also figured that the best way to make a family would be to build one? That's not bad as far as twists go, but the real question is, why? We know the response he gave, couldn't find the right girl, in part due to his taxing work. But going from dateless to building an entire person isn't a normal response by any means. So why does Mr. Hartford act fairly normal? If he's this bad at getting dates, despite his interesting stories and insane wealth, wouldn't recruiting people and guiding a team be the last thing he'd want to do? As Rose once states, he's rich, he could buy an army. Or he could build one, which would probably be the first thing he'd think to do, since Mac was clearly a success, so his methodology works. But instead, what we get is a plain, ordinary, everyday sort of mentor. Nothing horrible, but nothing special either, which is very jarring because he's clearly not normal. But this series never showcases what traits, or lack of traits, led him to this point. Conversely, we know exactly why Dr. K is socially lacking and emotionally distant, and we know exactly how that's both expressed and adjusted as RPM progresses. And that's really where the Mac twist ends up falling short, because it is, by its very nature, more of a Mr. Hartford reveal than a Mac reveal. It should be a deep, perhaps unsettling, look into the psyche of a man we didn't know as well as we thought. And yet, nothing was established prior to this point to suggest anything of the sort. Sure, it's a shock in the moment, but there's no legs for it to stand on when you think about it after the fact. Several seasons have this issue, where there's a disconnect between a character's past and how we see that affecting his or her present. Highlighting Ninja Storm again, we see that with Sensei, who seems almost oblivious to the fact that his students are fighting his brother. But at the very least, we understand that even as a younger Win student, Kanoi wasn't bothered by much on the surface, and maybe Lothor's fate is also in part informing his need to keep Cam safe, in addition to his late wife's wishes, so we can at least connect the dots there to an extent. But with Mr. Hartford, nothing about Overdrive really changes if Mac was a real boy the whole time, especially since the aftermath of that reveal comes off as forgettable filler. In the end, I don't think it's crazy to assume that one has to be severely desperate, having gone through something huge, to build and then lie to a robotic son. Would have been a hell of a backstory, but as is, there's no real shock value here, because it's all shock and no value, and all because this man's only real character trait was doting dad. This naturally spills over to Mac as a character, who's a solid one, but since the reveal doesn't do much, he ends up as just part of the ride. The idea of him not valuing his life as much was interesting, since he views himself as replaceable or rebuildable now, but before and after those moments, the leader of this team doesn't really stand out. But in a way, that's kind of fitting. This team was all assembled with specific traits in mind, all except for Mac, who was just assembled. So him contributing only so much when it's all said and done can be seen as par for the course. But it then becomes easy to see where the connection could have been made. Mac as a character could have been framed as a version of Casey, who's behind the others in terms of usefulness and not as much fighting skills. He started off as a character who wanted to make a difference despite his father's wishes, so it could have easily worked. And then, when he keeps pushing himself as a leader and as an individual, maybe we see an extremely quick learning curve for him, perhaps even an inhuman learning curve, thus setting up the twist a little better. All that effort put into the Ranger mission and impressing his overprotective father, only to realize that his so-called efforts were all just programs and hard wiring? Was he even in control the whole time? Which memories are real? And what else did Father Dearest program into him? That would be a real kicker. Not just Mac being a robot, but Mac really questioning how genuine his progress is, how genuine his father's pride is. Is he even the first Mac? That's real character conflict right there, inside and out. Again, I think Mac's a good enough character, and he'd probably be a better one in a better season, but good enough was never going to be enough to save the unique mess that is Operation Overdrive. For as wonderful as Spencer is, there's not a ton that needs to be analyzed with regards to why. He's a sassy British butler. Of course he's going to be funny. Mix that in with some genuinely great advice and insight, and you've got yourself a winning supporting character. I know you're all waiting for him, so let's get this over with. Dax Low. Let's be real here, guys. Dax is not the worst Ranger ever. He can be funny sometimes. He can even be likable, rarely. Well, hey, I didn't say he was good either. But here's where I take issue with Dax's involvement. He never really changes, which is problematic, not just because of who he is, but because he does want to change. He doesn't want to just be the stuntman. He wants to be the star, and that's a great aspiration. Except they never tie in that desire to the Ranger mission. He wants to be more, but yet, any chance he gets, he continues to act like a sideshow, never showing any growth or maturity, to the point where even when he does get his chance, it's at the expense of the Ranger mission. But that's fine too. Maybe this is Dax realizing that even a supporting role is still important. It's a poorly structured episode in that case, but still, it's not nothing. But then when it's all said and done, Dax reveals that actually, he wants to take it one step further and become a director. Why? You pushed your Ranger duties away twice. When everyone ended up quitting for a spell, you were not directing, you were not leading, you were following. Again. Maybe if you were the one guy that's like, well, I still got these cool civilian powers, I can still be useful, then that would have been a great moment. And what would that have symbolized? Stepping out of the shadows and proving to yourself and everyone else that you can be a star, that you can take command, that you can take the harder path and achieve the higher result. But that didn't happen. Nothing like that ever happened. So why is Overdrive pretending that it did? Dax's biggest problem isn't his big mouth. His biggest problem is that he's written for in ways more random than the plot of Overdrive itself. Speaking of characters that push their Ranger duties away twice, enter Will Aston. Interestingly enough, Will kind of functions a little better than most of his comrades. The problem is, several of the things that make sense about him don't make him a better character. When he does quit, or when he does act standoffish, we know why. Unlike Dax, Rose, and Mac, all of whom in one way or another wanted something more out of their lives, Will's life was fulfilling enough for him as is. He was good at what he did, and he didn't need anyone else to do it. On that level, his connection to Ronnie makes a lot of sense, since she also harbors no overwhelming desire to do more prior to Overdrive. But, that having been said, one thing we really don't see from Will is a realization. After he quits, he does show this nagging urge to get back in the game after a pep talk from the wonderful Spencer. But what would have made that moment hit a bit harder is this. Realizing that maybe the reason those urges do exist is because there was something missing this whole time. We start to see that through what him and Ronnie have, but that side of things never got enough time to breathe. I'm not even sure if most people would count their dynamic as romantic. And just think about how that could have connected to Mr. Hartford. Two men with extremely interesting jobs they're really good at, and yet not a lot of time for people, and both dealt with that in their own ways. but maybe if Overdrive had highlighted that subtle similarity, both could have grown more from it. But as is, Will seems to fade into the background whenever he's not directly involved with the plot. And then, when his focus episodes are over, it's like nothing ever happened, a consistent problem for this season. And that shouldn't have been the case. The Disney-era writers were experts at serialized storytelling, especially when it came to characters. SPD, RPM, Jungle Fury, even some choice Mystic Force characters had a great sense of progression. But not as much here. And for the life of me, I don't understand why. Which brings us to Ronnie Robinson, who is maybe not a great ranger per se, but she might be the best ranger on this team. She had this infectious competitive spirit about her that ultimately grew on me, and her overall excitability for a mission that not everyone seemed overly excited about was nice to have. It brought the best out of Will, and it brought the best out of Tizen, and those 2 points alone make her valuable in ways the others can't match. Overdrive was dumb in the way they handled several ideas, but not her, because they understood that the high level of emotion that literally and figuratively drove her to be the best racer could be used in other ways, namely to bring out or handle the emotions of the pair of aforementioned characters. It felt incomplete at times, because it seemed like they always stopped halfway with what Ronnie could do for the team, but it was always there. And because of that, her quitting alongside the others hurt most of all, because everything we saw from her before then ensured us that she'd be the last to ever consider such an option. Overdrive missed a great chance to take us through the actual conversations the team had prior to this point, because I just know that Ronnie, despite having a successful career to return to, would have pushed back more than most. It's just not like her to do differently. And the hollow cup symbolism after the fact, spot on. She wanted to be here, and I can't help but think we were a few scenes removed from getting an even better character. But with Rose, I think it would have taken a bit more work. I like Rose, more than most I'm guessing. I like how they use parts of her past as a means to explain her need to constantly pursue intelligence, but even she has problems as a character, mainly because the only way they could think to challenge her is by showing her what fun looks like. And again I ask, why? She was never presented as this stoic ice queen who desperately needs to lighten up. In fact, she's more playful and cocky with her intelligence than anything. She's by far the most valuable ranger on this team for this mission specifically, and she knows it. These guys would be stuck on Jewel 2 without her insight, but Overdrive never figures out how to then use that as a platform for team growth. An important part of her character is her need to feel special. That in large part informs her at times overbearing intellectualism. But at no point does anyone ever effectively confront the overbearing part. Intelligence is something to be highly valued, not exactly breaking news coming from me, but not at the cost of alienating everyone else. Something Rose has probably done a lot over her years, since she herself claims that she is quote-unquote never wrong. So, if the angle here is non-traditional childhood, then I see that as a great opportunity for her to learn about everyone else. Rose could have learned more about their childhoods and what each of them did for fun. It'd feel a lot more natural and build the team a lot better than a pirate ever could. And best of all, everyone benefits by looking more like complete characters. What a team of strangers needed was something holding them together. Rose could have been that, because there's a viable reason for her to connect to others now. Then, maybe, just maybe, it takes a little bit more than a broken grid to get them all to quit. Tizen is probably the most interesting character inherently. He comes from a different planet, he's been torn apart by his mistakes, and he's been actively tracking down his past ever since. We're given a solid arc where he can face up to his past and repent as a ranger. But, like I mentioned with Mac, I just don't think it was good enough. We've seen this with Magna Defender, we've seen this with Merrick, heck, technically we've seen this with Jen. So here, on this, the season that marks the 15th birthday of the franchise, Tizen really had to stand out to not just be a rehashed plot point, and I don't really think he did. Doesn't make him or his backstory bad, but it is somewhat disconcerting when a season filled with new ideas can't figure out a more interesting path for our Man of Mercury. For example, I think a lot more could have been done with his monster form. The symbolism would be a little on the nose, but maybe emphasize the fact that he looks the way he feels inside now. Similar to Zenaku, yes, but this time you can show the entire descent into madness and eventual repentance, because as is, it never really felt like Tizen was that far away from being Ranger ready. If he's still chasing the Fear Cats, if he's still trying to absolve himself from his past mistakes, prove it. But just like with Mr. Hartford, we're left understanding his past without really feeling his past to the emotional extent it demanded. Oddly enough, it really felt like the often overly ambitious Overdrive was playing things safe here. I don't think we need to discuss Sentinel Knight or the villains here, since my original Overdrive video did a number on them already. We also didn't discuss the team dynamics in as much detail, but in a way, that says more, because there isn't much happening there. Beyond the points I made for Ronnie, Overdrive really does feel more like individual parts force fit together than a cohesive unit. And the same can be said of many of the plot points as well. There's just not a ton of connective tissue here, so it's harder to know what matters and what doesn't, which in turn makes it harder to care. That's not a problem exclusive to Overdrive, but with all their other problems, it only made things worse. But those are just some of my thoughts on Overdrive's underwhelming team and how they maybe could have been something more. I honestly think every single character here could have been great. Keyword though, could have. But as per usual, let me know what you think about this particular team of Rangers down below. And as always, thanks for watching.